This presentation on Baalbek will be quite different from the usual mystification videos, where the only conclusion reached is that yes, positively there was an ancient advanced civilization, but we don't know anything about it. Sometimes we get so carried away while mystifying things that we forget to start learning and exploring the actual site. Baalbek is a rather famous archaeological site, and yet there is very little actual research done over there. Even very basic things like the size of the site, the monument itself, even that is completely different in the various so-called scientific publications. So were they really measuring it? Or what about the so-called 3D reconstruction? Did the so-called researchers who made it even visit the site, because there are no remains of any roof at all, what to speak of these ceramic tiles covering the site? If these enormous buildings were really covered with ceramic tiles, then the remains would be all over the place, but they are none at all. If we judge the actual remains, the ruins that are found on site, it would have looked like this, or maybe even smaller like this. It also appears that it never reached completion, its building project. Also, what about the metal pipes and other stuff sticking out of the stones? Has anybody tested the composition of these metal elements or studied them at all? At places, lower layers of wall and building is visible as deep as 10 meters below ground level. Why no further excavations are done? Why mainstream historians don't like to study Baalbek? Because just by visiting there, even a layman, unprofessional, starts doubting the validity of the so-called history. First of all, the very idea of evolution comes quickly under question, because the building techniques were supposedly evolving as we were supposedly evolving. However, in Baalbek, the more advanced building techniques are on the bottom and not on the top. Two building techniques are clearly visible even to non-professionals just by visiting the site. The professionals identify few more layers, but even they agree that yes, the biggest stones and the more advanced techniques are on the bottom. So what? The building techniques are clearly devolving while we were evolving? And not only that, the full site is so huge, the stones are so large, they just don't fit human size. And so they have no clue what kind of explanation to offer to people. People may simply not buy the usual fairy tales of drag, push and pull like idiot. All kinds of wooden sledges, carts or any sort of devices break during test times, even under stones that are much smaller than those of Baalbek. Other standard fairy tale explanations like endless slaves also seem quite inapplicable, again looking at the sheer size of the stones. And more reasons to make Baalbek unpleasant for mainstream historians. Again, those nasty machine marks. How to explain them to people if you are trying to convince them that this is what's going on actually? Primitive hillbillies hitting their heads with stones. So where did the hillbillies get the machinery that in some cases, by the way, surpasses our own, judging by the magnitude and the size of the tool marks left? Or if we suggest that the Baalbek was also made of geopolymers, then how did the hillbillies know geopolymer recipes that even we don't know nowadays? I mean, we produce much uglier cement, polluting a lot the environment while producing it, and even that cement lasts whatever 100 years, and then the houses just fall apart. So the hillbillies could make it more beautiful without pollution or any traces of technology, and it would last thousands of years. Since the standard approach of telling fairy tales is unsuitable in this case, they resort to other tactics like mystify and distract attention. Mystify means declare it a mystery, pretend that you're interested in finding out the answer, well, that's exactly what you don't want, and then hope that the people will not notice that you excluded from history. And then divert attention. That is a sweet approach. Since the site has something to do with the so-called Roman style, just distract people's attention with spicy Roman sex stories. For example, millions of pounds are allotted to producing sensational soap operas that are clearly served as history. It is underlined many times that these are actual historic stories, not a fiction. Over there we see in great detail how a certain emperor, he cut the hairs of an army of prostitutes because he was insane, and with those prostitutes he was intending to fight a war, and so on and so on. So they allot the millions from taxpayers' money for producing soap operas about the Roman prostitutes' haircutting, and in the full documentary that had many episodes, not even mention of the most impressive construction of the so-called Roman Empire, not a single mention of how did they do these miracles, how did they construct it. Not only distracting, even using the pretext to fill up our consciousness with nasty scenes of perversion and call this historical education. And always when it comes to some really advanced construction, just no mention of it. Assure us that even most minor documentation is saved from the times of Roman Empire, including how many workers were allotted for all kinds of mundane tasks like taking care of the slaves, counting properties, measuring land and all that, how much was it paid to them, how many workers they had, how many days did they do a lot to. All this is known for the full Roman Empire, historians tell us, and not even a single mention about who, when, or how constructed Baalbek. Is this even possible? And if it was only for one site, I could be just overly suspicious, but it is a pattern. Always, when it comes to some advanced construction, there is always no record for everything else, but how they did the things that we cannot do. Like, for example, the megalithic aqueducts, again, absolutely no record of them, even who built them at all. Or what about the supposed strong concrete that is supposedly holding for 2000 years, of which the roof of the famous Pantheon in Rome is made? They documented every ant in Rome, but when it came to the recipe of this cement or beton or whatever it is, well, exactly that is not documented. Probably some of you will object me at this point and remind me that yes, they are showing Roman sawmills on TV, and these are the sophisticated Roman machines with which they were supposedly cutting the stone, and this is the artifact on the basis of which these sawmill reconstructions were done. Yes, I agree, there is some sort of machinery shown on this carving. But what you are shown on the mainstream documentaries are not working models, but fantasy sketches. First of all, these machines are even supposedly made for marble only, and that doesn't explain how was all the granite cut and in some cases polished to perfection, like the columns in this very same Baalbek. Let's see if we stand any chance to find any solution for the megalith building of aqueducts and other miracles by Romans with the help of their machines. Well, as far as practical tests, there have been some. So they made something that was cutting with the speed of 7 millimeters per hour. That is their own report, and eventually they managed to cut through 10 centimeters deep. That was their achievement. They made a cutting that was 10 centimeters deep. Softest stone, which was marble. So in other words, they could not demonstrate even cutting one of these huge megalithic blocks that the Romans supposedly were using. Even those heroic 10 centimeters that they managed to cut, I'm really not sure with what kind of equipment that they did that, because if you remember the link that I posted in the last episode about the so-called nose that they carved, it was called a demonstration of how the ancients would do stone carving, and if you watch the actual documentary, they showed that those tools cannot cut, and eventually they made it with modern tools. So they demonstrated that the ancients could not have done it with the tools that we are led to believe that they possessed, and yet they called the documentary demonstration of ancient stonework. So this time they are not even showing us on TV their stone cutting demonstration, and from other sources I have heard that it was a complete failure. And in their own reports, there are some suspicious hints, like we still don't know how could they have done certain elements with those tools. What does this mean? This means that they cannot basically reproduce it with simple available tools as we're led to believe they had at that time, and most likely there were some modern elements, and that is what is this all for cutting one single marble piece of 10 centimeters, and that took them 2 full working days. So far I reviewed the attitude of the mainstream researchers, but there is a second category as well, and I will call them naive alternative. They arrive at the site and see a clear difference between the lower stage of construction, the one with huge blocks, and the upper one, the so-called Roman one, with smaller blocks. They do notice that the civilization that built the base is totally missing from the so-called history, and yet even after that they naively continue to believe, the same historians that have excluded it, about the upper so-called Roman part. And because they totally believe that the Roman Empire is very well studied in detail, that makes them blind to notice the mysteries from the Roman part and start learning from them. Although the so-called Roman part definitely consists of smaller blocks, the fact that they are smaller doesn't mean that they are manageable. Just look at the sheer size of the Roman columns. Some of them, some engineers, even nowadays sincerely doubt that we could reproduce this building nowadays with our advanced technology, moreover at the very difficult local terrain. And even if somehow we manage to drag, pull and lift this size columns and build something similar, still we won't be able to do it with the precision that they did it. Because not only the old ones, but also the Roman stones fit each other with a remarkable precision. You see a footage how a member of the expedition of Andrei Sklarov is trying to insert a dollar bill and even a euro note bill between the stones. And as it is becoming very clear, these currencies are very, very thin and not backed by anything. Right now he's showing the actual gap between the stones. The gap is 0. So even these very thin, backed by nothing currencies cannot go in the gaps. They are so precise. Can we do such fitting today? Of course we can, in a smaller scale, especially in jewelry work. But what about a larger scale? Well, as I said, we cannot even make a sample demonstration of how we could build Baalbek now, because we could not finance such a construction on such a large scale with jewelry precision. So the population was supposedly, according to mainstream history that the alternatives also believe, population was much smaller at that time. Taxes were 10-20%, and still people could finance such a construction, and would have been much more costly at that time, because the technology is again supposedly much more imperfect than us, and yet they did it and we can't. So the full story does not fit at all. And then comes the main question that the naive alternative should be asking themselves, but they are not doing it at all. And the question is there any proof at all that there is a connection with Rome, the way we imagine it, as with its center, the city of Rome in Italy, and Baalbek? Not only there is no written record, they documented almost every ant in their empire, supposedly, according to mainstream historians, and yet not even a line about constructing their most amazing, biggest monument and the biggest architectural achievement. Isn't it strange? And I'm not talking about building techniques. I'm even talking about mentioning which emperor commissioned it and so on, or repaired it. No mention at all, just a 0. For simplicity's sake, let's assume that one of their hypotheses, the main one, is true, namely that the biggest builder of all Roman emperors, Nero, built Baalbek, or at least made the Roman finishing, the top part. He is the one who supposedly built the most amazing buildings in the city of Rome. So let's hope that he was the one as well who commissioned the repair of Baalbek. This is the famous palace of Nero in Rome. What we see, mud bricks. Compared to Baalbek, this is just primitive. So do you really believe that Rome paid for the repair of that huge temple on a territory that was its own, supposedly for a relatively very short time, and was always in a region of war? They were holding it, losing it, and all that. And while during the battles they financed its building, while they could not finance their own palaces in Rome to be built in the same way. I don't believe this. Huge columns out of solid stone or geopolymer. In some cases, they suggest that the granite for Baalbek was actually imported all the way from Aswan. That's 2,000 kilometers away. So the Roman emperors could do that for Baalbek, and yet they lived themselves in so-called palaces of mud bricks. There is this famous, at least in mainstream circles, story that the Nero, the famous Roman builder emperor, he had to rob the temples of Rome out of their gold to finance his constructions, and especially some famous column, a huge column. So that was so expensive and such a burden on Rome, and so that books were written about this event, and yet absolutely secretly they built hundreds of other much bigger columns in Baalbek, and no mention about how did they finance that. This is very strange. Yet others believe that Baalbek has something to do with Rome because of the couple of Roman inscriptions that are indeed found on the site. These inscriptions don't say that any Roman emperor built Baalbek at all. All these inscriptions are testimony that most likely people who used Latin were here as doing something, visiting or something like that, unless they are fakes, because there are also many fake Latin inscriptions. Moreover, there are many inscriptions in other languages in Baalbek, especially many of them in Arabic. So none of the inscription gives any information about who built Baalbek. They're only a testimony that at some unknown point of time, a person who spoke Latin or Arabic or other language was there and did something. Others think that Baalbek has anything to do with the city of Rome just because the architecture looks very much in Greco-Roman style. But historic buildings with such ornaments are found in many places in Africa, Europe, Asia, Japan, China, as we saw in earlier episode. We will see also a lot in Russia, much more than you would expect. Rome is definitely not the biggest city that has buildings in this style, so that by itself is not a reason in any way to connect it to Baalbek. Probably somewhere at the back regions of your mind you still connect Baalbek with Rome, because Rome is supposedly the center of this Roman or Greco-Roman culture. But I'm starting here to show from different sides the aqueducts, Baalbek, that Rome was not at all the center of this culture, and it was a relatively small city, not at all impressive like the others, and all these ideas of its military influence and military might are only theoretical and are based on the so-called ancient Roman authors, which we discussed in detail, were usually not ancient and in many cases even not Roman. Since those books were edited or composed just a couple of hundred of years ago, when the current so-called history was being composed, then they were the last stronghold of this hope that this is actually Rome is the center of this Roman culture. So what are we left with any other proofs? Well, none. All we have is stories that don't match each other. And so if Rome had nothing to do with Baalbek, then who built it? Was it really giants, like the local legends say, that the giants came here to restore the site after the Great Flood? It was damaged. Well, possibly they had something to do with the lower layers of construction. Some of the older steps are somewhat uncomfortable for humans, but as far as the upper so-called Roman stages of building, they are designed to serve humans of our size. So yes, in the beginning, most likely there could have been giants, but then there were our size humans as well. And what we can start learning and noticing is that the humans were recipients of the old technology. They knew, even those who were building at the later stages, they still knew many of the secrets of the giants. In other words, we don't see a sharp disappearance of the advanced building techniques, but a gradual one. which very elegantly fits with the history of the survivors that I'm suggesting, that it is a one of gradual degradation rather than a civilization that went missing and ceased to exist thousands of years ago. Do you remember this French megalithic aqueduct? Officially, it is built some 200-300 years ago, and yet we see all the hallmarks of these mystery alien megaliths, even the protrusions, huge blocks, precise fitting, probably also no mortar, that I cannot say for sure, but still, the people who did this still knew many of the secrets. Of course, in many cases, they put the date of repair of similar constructions as their construction date, you know, to cover up the traces of who and when actually initially built it. And that could be the case with the French aqueduct, but it could not be as well, and possibly this was indeed built very recently, and very recently even in France there were people who still knew these secrets. If some of you are more curious and hardworking enough to delve into old libraries and search forgotten books, they may even find something. People tried that approach in Russia and found the book Spravotchnik Kustarea, the link I provided in the previous episodes. Let's return to our group called Naive Alternative. Andrei Sklarov did a great job. He meticulously studied Baalbek, measured everything, and noticed many interesting things. First of all, the legend of being rebuilt is absolutely true, because many of the stones were not originally meant for the places that they are currently found on. Pieces of columns are found in the walls, and in one instance that is even under one of the famous trilithons. That means that either the giants also themselves had to rebuild Baalbek, or the Romans did it. Maybe they also handled the trilithons. It is a possibility, why not? Maybe they were not as pathetic as their miserable descendants, I mean ourselves. When we were rebuilding Abu Simbel, the full monument had to be shifted some distance away due to floods and stuff. We had to cut the stones because we couldn't handle them so big. It was uncomfortable for us. And then at a particular day of when the sun was in particular location, it was casting light through a special hole, and it was lightening some special room that was working in the original monument. And then when we shifted it, we, with our precise tools and calculations, we could not position the monument in such a way, and now this doesn't function. Another interesting point noted by Sklarov is that in some places the ceilings are made of flying stones, although it would have been much easier to put big slabs. Another point that he was very astute to notice and measure is that the famous three trilithons are actually 7. There are 7 stones currently in Baalbek, not including the loose one, that could qualify for the title trilithons. And another point is that the huge one that is still found in the quarry was as if meant for one of the corners that seems to be still incomplete. And also, as far as I understand, there are no granite quarries anywhere in Lebanon. So, and the nearest one is in Aswan in Egypt. Did they really drag the stones for 2000 kilometers? Or did they make it out of a geopolymer recipe? Anyways, in case it was the first option, then it's very similar to the case of the Ethiopian megaliths. They also use stone that is not found locally, and the nearest location is this time almost 3000 kilometers away. And again, it is that very Aswan. Let's get back to Sklarov. After being such a smart cookie and noticing so many details, let's see what he says about the Roman part of Baalbek. He's a believer in the traditional historic chronology and timeline. So on the topic of how did the Romans build the so-called small blocks, manageable part of Baalbek, what he says, well, they must have done it somehow. By pulling, dragging, lifting, and so on. I don't know exactly how, he continues, but surely it must be possible because even the biggest column, he says so, made out of single stone slab, which is found in St. Petersburg, the Alexander column, was also erected by hand and relatively primitive means. And so we are getting closer to the most interesting part. Wait a minute, so this Alexander column, and by the way hundreds of other huge columns in St. Petersburg, look exactly like that polished granite columns in Baalbek. So maybe they did it in the same way as they did it in Russia. Well, probably they did, and the next similarity is that in Russia, even for this so-called recent construction, again, all records are absolutely and totally missing. The technology is just not mentioned. There are tons of really tons. You can fill up truckloads with books about the construction of St. Petersburg and no description of any feasible technical specifications of how these columns were manufactured or placed at their place. Next similarity, the construction of St. Petersburg is considered very well documented, same as Rome. Very similar distract attention situation like with Rome. So about the building of St. Petersburg, they're distracting our attention in those fat books with fairy tales about how a certain builder met two bears when he was, I don't know, 5 years old, and he fought with them with bare hands and he won and he was that strong, something like that. It's funny, and when it comes to actual building specification or some plan of the city or anything like that, total zero. And next similarity with Baalbek, again small-scale non-working models are presented to trick the public into believing that there is any clue of how this has been done. But when specialists, and even in some cases non-specialists, invest a bit of thinking, we will do this in a very near future in one of the episodes that is coming soon, we'll find out that such models, sketches, and paintings have nothing to do with the possible reality of how these miraculous buildings in St. Petersburg were erected. And it will be even more fishy than Baalbek, because for Baalbek, at least there is some logic when they say, oh, we don't know, it was too long ago. But then we have something happening 200-300 years ago, and then they're not, it's kind of silly to say we don't know. So they present non-working models, and that's how all this discovering of the new history started, by the way, in Russia, that builders and sculptors noticed, wait a minute, this doesn't work. Why are we presented with some toy models that are just a joke? Let's take just one building, for example, the Sakivsky Sobor. You see the lower row of columns? This is how they look in reality. This is gigantic, and they're made of a single piece of stone or geopolymer. And these are the small ones on the top row. So these small ones, the baby ones on the top, they weigh only 64 tons each. And they're at the height of 14-storied high building. So we are offered to believe that they were lifted there with some wooden scaffolding and ropes. These ropes must have been a meter thick, you can't even bind them. Anyway, they don't even try to make any fantasy sketch or model of anything like this because it will look ridiculous. Actually, a journalist mentioned even that even with our current modern technology, we don't have cranes that could accomplish this. It's not wise to always believe journalists just like that. That's why I'm giving homework to my male listeners who like a building to really check, do we have such cranes? And don't check that, do we have a crane that can lift 64 tons? Yes, but at what height? And then at what distance can they move it away after that? That is the most problematic stuff here, because the columns were placed there after the first floor of the building was constructed, and not before that. Also, there were other buildings around. So before I have started making the St. Petersburg episode, it will be nice to hear some real male opinion of is this really possible even with modern means to place these columns. The baby ones on the top, I mean. And the similarities with St. Petersburg don't end here. Now this is Baalbek. This is a very often used design, the swastika design. It is in many places in Baalbek. This is a Baalbek photo. Very same swastika in the very same way is found on in Russian museums. These are supposed to be some 3,000–4,000 years old swastikas from Russian museums. I don't believe that dating, but at least it is some sort of historic artifact. And then pay attention to the deco element at the top of the columns in Baalbek. One to one, the same design is all over St. Petersburg as if they were using the same mold when they were casting them. Is it really possible that those mysterious advanced building techniques did not die thousands of years ago, but are getting lost gradually even nowadays, and even a few hundred years ago was still used? Yes, actually not only possible, that is exactly the case, and not only in Russia. In various locations on Earth, branches of the knowledge are still alive to some extent. For example, in the Amazon forest, they still know how to cross the boundaries between the dimensions. Another example are the real masters of martial arts that still keep some knowledge of amazing energy work from the survivors. It is not by chance that good care is taken that the human rights of the tribal people are not respected, and they are hunted down by corporations and even killed. I mean, in Peru they send their own army to clear up territories, which means killing up the locals to open up factories, deforestation and other nasty stuff. They're hunted down like animals because they still remember a few bits and pieces of the wisdom that survivors gave them. But let's get back where we left off, Mr. Sklarov. Although his international recognition is growing nowadays, his rating in his own country is going down. People are blaming him for not giving enough attention to the recently discovered gigantic Russian megaliths. During a conference, when time came for questions and answers, somebody asked Sklarov, "Why are you not researching the Russian megaliths?" And he answered, "I don't intend even visiting them because our organization is devoted to studying ancient advanced technologies. And on these megaliths, on the photos, I don't see any hope to find any advanced tool marks. That is why I see no point going there. There is nothing to be studied." This is a common pitfall for many alternative researchers. They expect the ancient technologies to fit their limited expectations, and if they are outside of this small box, they are not even looking for them. Some of the building blocks of the Russian megaliths are far bigger than the tritons in Baalbek. Lines that you see are not just cracks in the stone. These are the gaps, again, very thin between the stones. Around lay down scattered the loose stones with many right angles and so on. Obviously this is a man-made structure. It is a wall. Usually, most of the megaliths, only a wall has remained until now. So obviously these stones were somehow shaped, moved, or something somehow formed into a wall by an intelligent design. And to say that I see no tool marks on them, that's why they were done in a primitive way, is actually ridiculous. And at the same time is an excellent example of how narrow-mindedness can prevent even brilliant researchers like Sklarov to find out because the actual technologies that were used, just because his scope of search is not widened enough. So what if they were, for example, growing them instead of cutting, moving, and so on? I don't really think that's the technology used, especially in Baalbek, and I have absolutely no reason to think that this is the technology that was used for the Russian megaliths, but it is just a nice example of how many possibilities are out there. You haven't heard about growing stones? They grow like mushrooms, especially in Romania. These cute chaps are well known in Romania. They have babies, they grow, they multiply, especially they love rain, and that's when they grow a lot. Inside there is a kind of core, and the growth appears in circles around this core, and gradually smaller cores appear as well. And as the stone grows, they also get separated. Those are the babies, and they roll away and they start becoming adult ones themselves. And in the light of all I said so far, so as a conclusion, how was Baalbek built after all? I would give two options. First of all, it could have been cast out of geopolymer, and it is entirely possible that the recipe for this geopolymer is found in the book Spravочник Кустаря that I provided the link to earlier. Or maybe and slash or, both techniques could have been used at different times. Maybe it was indeed created by real stones that were moved around by a giant magical race. Are you still having a hard time wrapping your mind around it? Well, levitation is much more of a real thing than the so-called history that we are being taught, and magical levitation fits in the artifacts very well, unlike the so-called history, which doesn't fit at all to its own stories even. Wanna see and touch real magicians? Well, that I can provide as well. A YouTube user sent me an amazing video compilation of real magicians. Just see what the master is doing to those black belts, and he is not really touching them. And why only see? Why not even educate yourself? That is absolutely possible. It is definitely an alternative to getting hypnotized every day by the TV, drinking coke and overeating. I experienced something very similar on myself in the Amazon forest while with the shamans. One a very experienced and old one, he was actually able to move me from a distance. And in general, I noticed with the shamans, those that are still learning, still young, they are more into external rituals and moving, objects, performing. Well, the really old ones, the really good ones, they just sit in the corner and do nothing, and just move the energies, and even with the people, with just by singing, making slight hand movements, or even just by thinking.
His heel.
Kita biasanya
Then he asked for our newspaper. He says that what he does is no more supernatural than an electric eel, which also knows how to harness its yin and yang energies.
And is this because you're special? You have a special sort of
it's
body?
meditation every day.
It's meditation that does it.
Meditation every day. But I study about 18 years.
18 years.
18 years from my child people.
And are we really talking about lost civilization now, or a civilization that we simply don't notice because we are blinded? A civilization that we simply don't notice because we are always under the hypnosis of some sort of cheap low-class entertainment. We are exactly like that simple villager who went to a zoo and saw a giraffe standing in front of him. The villager said, "This cannot be. Just look at it. Its neck is so long, the head is so funny, and just the whole thing looks so strange. This animal cannot exist." The animal was standing right in front of him, and yet he said, "There is no such animal."